Hello, hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for wearing a matching outfit. This is going to
That's
be
right. I was thinking about that as you were on.
okay. I'm going to do the intro segment and then we'll be good to go here. The incoming Biden administration is promising to take the climate crisis seriously, which will be nice, especially after the last 4 years and say, well, the last few hundred years or even before, when it would have been nice if we had adjusted our attitude toward the earth and all her inhabitants to be, say, loving kindness instead of predation in order to redress the harm caused by centuries of predatory economic policy that have led to climate chaos. We need to talk about who is being most impacted by the outcome. And of course, unfortunately, it's people of color. Carmen Gonzalez, professor of law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, and a world renowned expert in international environmental law, human rights, and the environment, environmental justice, and food security, is here to talk about what we need to understand when it comes to environmental racism. Her recent piece, Climate Change and Racial Capitalism, can be found in the Journal of Law and Political Economy. Carmen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, can we talk about the term racial capitalism? It was mentioned throughout your recent piece. Ground us in what you mean by the use of that term.
Racial capitalism refers to the fact that racism and capitalism are inextricably intertwined. They developed at the same time and they cannot be separated one from another. There are various ways of explaining this. One is that capitalism's origins are in a feudal system that was deeply, deeply imbued with racial or proto-racial categories. Groups like the Irish, Jews, Slavs were considered not quite white. And then in addition, it's the conquest of the Americas that for the first time launches capitalism, at global capitalism, and deeply embeds racism into the system. The justification for the conquest of indigenous lands, for indigenous genocide, is that indigenous peoples were simply not up to the European standard and that they had to be under European tutelage and assimilate to European norms. And if they refused, then this was a just war. This was the justification for conquering them, for treating them as aggressors. Similarly, international law, it justifies chattel slavery, the enslavement of Africans, based on the same hierarchy, the same racial hierarchies that are with us to this day. So the very origins of capitalism are racialized, and the ways in which capitalism continues to play itself out, including the fossil fuel-based economy, are deeply, deeply racialized.
Ooh, talk about the economic policies that have allowed resource extraction to occur in a way that is threatening our existence on this planet.
Again, when you look at the beginnings of the fossil fuel-based economy, it's the Industrial Revolution in Europe. But what made the Industrial Revolution in Europe possible was the lands that were seized in the Americas and the labor of enslaved Africans in the Americas. The cotton that was used in European industry, the sugar that fed the industrial workforce, originated from the Americas. So slavery and colonialism are not sort of peripheral and incidental. They are the foundation of the Industrial Revolution that launched the age of fossil fuels. And then if you look at the impact of fossil fuels all over the world, it's overwhelmingly racialized communities that are in the places where the fossil fuels are extracted, where the fossil fuels are burned, who suffer the disproportionate consequences to their health of proximity to fossil fuels. When you look at the incessant, unending wars in the Middle East over petroleum, there again, you see the impact on racialized communities of the extraction of fossil fuels. And of course, ironically, when you have Arab and Muslim populations in those regions displaced and they try to flee to Europe or the United States, they are treated as potential terrorists and excluded. At every step of the way, including what is happening now, which regions are most vulnerable, you see racialized populations on the front lines. We saw it with Hurricane Katrina in the United States. We saw it with Hurricane Maria. But if you look globally, where are the most vulnerable communities? They're in the Arctic, they're in the small island states, they're in the low-lying coastal zones, overwhelmingly populated by people of color.
Ugh. Do you think that laws that would discourage, racial discrimination could be helpful here in terms of environmental policy? Or do we have to go at it from an environmental policy front across the board and just hope that it trickles down to marginalized populations?
It has to be both. We have to approach environmental policy aggressively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we have to be attentive to rectifying the injustices of the fossil fuel economy. Because if we don't do that, it's very easy to replicate the same injustices. And I can give you some examples of where the green economy is doing precisely that.
Yes, please.
In Mexico, for example, there are wind farms that have been constructed in Oaxaca, in one of the windiest areas of the world. And it's on the lands of indigenous peoples. But the energy is not going to the indigenous communities. It's actually going to large transnational corporations. And the indigenous peoples are bearing the harm. So they're not sharing in the benefits, and there's no mechanism to compensate them for the land loss that they're suffering. Second example. One of the mechanisms that is being used to encourage greenhouse gas mitigation is the conservation of forests and the granting of credits to those who actually pay to conserve forests. But in many places of the world, what's happening is that indigenous peoples are being evicted from the forests they have lived in since time immemorial. In theory, right, in the name of conservation, they are becoming what is known as conservation refugees. So if we don't deal very consciously with the disproportionate impacts on racialized populations, the risk is that in the green transition, we will replicate the same injustices. Instead of a just transition, we will have a transition that exacerbates pre-existing inequities.
What do you think are the top things that, say, a Joe Biden administration could do on his way in? And I am hearing a little bit of an echo, so hopefully we can get that corrected in a second there. What do you think a Joe Biden administration could do to, start the mitigation process in this area?
First, he can rejoin the Paris Agreement and have the United States present the United States as a leader and a collaborator instead of an obstacle. That he can do and has already announced that he will do. He can systematically go through every executive order that has been issued by President Trump that interferes with the transition to clean energy, and with a sign of it, with just a simple signature, he can reverse all of that. Phew. He can go systematically through every single pending regulation and figure out how he is going to address that. In some cases, it's simply switching positions on pending litigation. So there's so many things that he can do. And I know that his transition team is actually doing this. But the most important thing that has not been done to date, and that he has indicated a willingness to do, is to incorporate climate justice into the transition, to understand that there needs to be reparation to the communities that have disproportionately been harmed by climate change, and also good green jobs have to come out of this, that we can't separate the environmental from the social and the economic.
You write about the failures of international law in redressing the harm done to people of color as a result of the climate crisis. Can you talk about that?
First of all, international law has failed up to now in terms of addressing climate change. The Paris Agreement is too little, too late. Studies have shown the Paris Agreement is essentially every country voluntarily decides what they're going to do to mitigate their emissions. Yes, I can see from your expression.
I am not yet
And so every country has put forth what it's going to do. And then there's been a tally. The tally indicates that we are nowhere near where we need to be. We cannot allow emissions to go beyond 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels without climate catastrophe. And if every country complies with its proposals and its what it has agreed to do, we're going to get to 3 degrees, which is completely catastrophic. So in terms of mitigation, not enough has been done. The Paris Agreement also commits countries, affluent countries, to help finance climate adaptation in the global south. That has not happened. The commitments have been made, but the money has not been forthcoming. It is simply not enough. And then finally, what the regime does not do, it has a placeholder for this, but it has not yet come up with how the global community is going to address what will happen if mitigation and adaptation are not sufficient to forestall catastrophe and millions of people have to migrate. There is no legally binding mechanism for how to address climate displacement and who is responsible for assisting those who have been displaced.
How can international law be used as a way to address these issues?
There are a number of emerging approaches toward dealing with the issue of climate displacement. So I'm focusing on the last one. So let me backtrack. International law could be more aggressive in terms of boosting the ambition of countries to mitigate climate change. We have to begin there. International law could be more ambitious in terms of recognizing the need to finance adaptation. We have to start there. That is the most important thing that needs to be done most immediately. But we also need to be thinking ahead of what's going to happen if adaptation is not enough, if mitigation is not enough. What system are we going to have in place to address those who are displaced? And what countries facing imminent displacement and people facing imminent displacement have been asking for is a fund to facilitate, if absolutely necessary for them to migrate, a fund to facilitate migration, an agreement on the part of the global community, a recognition of the responsibility that especially affluent countries bear for displacement, and a commitment to either accept people or facilitate their move someplace else if that is where they would prefer to go.
How far off in the future do you believe these large-scale migrations are? It seems like we're seeing them already, but not as large scale as we're going to have.
Sometimes we're not calling them. So, for instance, if we look at Hurricane Katrina, over 175,000 people fled. 175,000 African Americans fled New Orleans. Only about 80 to 90,000 returned. So we're already seeing that there has been mass migration. Something similar happened in Puerto Rico. People fled, they didn't come back. This is within the United States, but it's an example of displacement. The most immediately vulnerable groups are in the Arctic. We have entire villages that have to relocate, and in the Pacific Islands, which have approximately 10 to 15 years before they become uninhabitable.
Unbelievable.
So we're not talking about a long-term problem. We're talking about something that's right in our backyards. And if the climate crisis intensifies and we have disaster after disaster after disaster, that timeline and the numbers of people affected will grow.
We're speaking with Carmen Gonzalez, professor of law at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, and world-renowned expert in international environmental law, human rights, and the environment, environmental justice, and food security. Can you talk for a moment? I know this is outside of the article that we're discussing, the climate change and racial capitalism, but it's something I'm always interested in where we are in terms of food security. It certainly seems like climate chaos has been affecting the food supply. That conversation has actually popped into the mainstream conversation in the news now that food chains have become of interest due to the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the reality of what we're facing?
We are facing catastrophic food insecurity all over the world. The numbers in the United States themselves are extraordinarily high. And it's also an important moment to think about our global food system and how it's structured and what makes sense. We have more than enough food to feed every single person on the planet. The issue has never been food scarcity, although it has been misrepresented as such. The issue is poverty. that people lack the income to buy the food they need. We see that in the United States. People lose their jobs, they can't afford food. But
People
ironically,
actually have 50, 40-hour a week, 50-hour a week jobs and still can't afford food.
exactly. So poverty is the issue behind food insecurity, or the food they can afford. This goes back to race because of segregation. People are living in areas that we call food deserts, where there isn't fresh, healthy food available. The only food available is fast food, cheap fast food. But ironically, if you shift the lens away from the United States and toward the global South, the worst food insecurity is being experienced in rural areas of the global South.
Mm.
And the reason people are food insecure is because of misguided or maybe deliberately intended aid trade policies, where we in the United States subsidize agribusiness, they overproduce, and the food is then dumped at low prices in the global South. And the consequence is that small farmers are kicked off the land. They no longer have the land to produce food, and they don't have sufficient income to buy the food that they need. And so there's a move globally toward a different way of thinking about the food system, and that is food sovereignty. And it doesn't mean complete food self-sufficiency. That might not be possible or desirable, but it means greater control over the food supply and less reliance on the large transnational corporations that dominate global trade in food. Smaller, closer links to food production.
Aren't these large transnational corporations that you mentioned, food corporations, aren't they more susceptible to a climate disruption than, say, smaller farms that are in people's areas, et cetera? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the disruption of global food chains as a consequence of the COVID crisis. Even within the United States, we're seeing how rapidly COVID spreads in these large processing plants. So we need to be rethinking the food system, because we should anticipate more situations like COVID. One of the consequences of our constant encroachment into forests and wetlands is that we come into more and more contact with wild animals that transmit diseases to humans and are going to spark additional pandemics. So the logic by which the way that we treat the natural world, the way that we extract from it without regenerating it, produces crisis after crisis. Climate change is one crisis. COVID is a second crisis. And it's very much a product of the same logic.
I appreciate you so much coming on to our program. Carmen Gonzalez, professor of law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, world-renowned expert in international environmental law, human rights and the environment, food security, and environmental justice. She has participated in the environmental law capacity building projects in Asia, Latin America, and the former Soviet Union. Her recent publications include International Environmental Law and the Global South and Energy Justice, U.S. and International Perspectives. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Such an important conversation that we need to have, often. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. We are here pretty much 5 days a week, but it's YouTube. So that really means we're here anytime you need us. Hit the like button on this particular video. And also if you're already subscribed or new subscriber, don't forget to hit the little alarm bell so that you can get notified when our new videos come up.